Really, we only got a few classes left here in the quarter. It's amazing how much time flies by. But we're looking and breaking down how language works and specifically how God uses it. And some of the just general principles. And that's really the goal of this class is general principles of how to understand the Bible in the way God expects it to be understood. That's the goal, because the problem that often happens is that you have the attitude of I interpret it the way I want to interpret it, which, that's a very human thing, right? You read into things what you want to read into things. If you've ever had a conversation with somebody and you walked away feeling self-conscious because you thought they said something about you when the reality was it had nothing to do with you, that was you reading something into a conversation that wasn't actually there. So the tendency is there as human beings to read something and read things in there that have to do with my own personal biases, not the truth. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about here in this class is when you are reading the Bible, you want to use the same rules of language that you use for everything else. And the reason for that is because God made language. God's the one who created nouns and verbs and adjectives and all those different rules of language. And yes, I understand every language is different, right? I'm not speaking in Russian right now. You're pretty aware of that. I'm barely speaking in English. But the fact is that the rules of language, that there are subjects, that every sentence has a subject and has an action, right? We call them nouns and verbs. As you go through and look at all languages, these things apply because God made these certain standards for language. So one of the things that we've been looking at is subject, action, and purpose, meaning if you change the subject, the action, or the purpose of anything that God has commanded, you're going to get yourself into trouble. So one of those examples is in carrying of the ark. In the case of Uzzah, they were supposed to have the Levites carry the ark, and in 2 Samuel, Uzzah did it anyways, and so he was struck dead because you had the wrong person doing the job. He reached out to touch the ark. He didn't have a right to touch the ark. In the case of Nadab and Abihu, they brought strange fire. The action was different. The fire came from a different source, and so you change the action and you've got a problem. Or in the case of Acts 19, you take baptism. Subject is right, meaning these are repentant believers. The action is right, it's immersion in water, but the purpose is different. Baptism of John is for a different purpose than the baptism of Jesus. So if you were baptized by the baptism of John, you need to be baptized again because the purpose is different. And so all of these things are normal things. And I'm not going to put a lot of time going into that because we've already spent quite a bit of it. But that then leads to the next piece of it, which is that whatever is necessary to fulfill a command for that subject, action, and purpose, to do the thing that God has said, whatever is necessary to fulfill it is inherent within it. And we talked about this from a variety of different ways, but one way to look at it is when you go back and talk about general versus specific commands. For example, when God gives Noah the command to build the ark, he's specific about what type of wood. What type of wood? Gopher wood, right? So since God is specific, you have to be specific too. But where does he get the gopher wood from? Anybody have any idea? Lowe's, yeah, maybe Lowe's. That would be nice. Pre-milled, right? Exactly, just exactly the way it ought to be. For some reason, that's not the way we typically envision it, is it? We imagine him having like a farm-to-table experience of building the ark. But the reality is could he easily have gotten it from some lumber yard? I mean, it's quite possible. Is there anything in that command that he's breaking if he goes to Lowe's and gets the gopher wood? No, right? But he's got to get it from somewhere. See, the answer isn't, well, the Bible doesn't say where, so nothing happened. No, it obviously happened. He had to get the gopher wood from somewhere. Whether he goes out to some forest himself, cuts down the tree, mills the wood, dries it out, all that kind of stuff. He goes through the whole process, or he goes down to local Lowe's and gets it. Either way, he had to get the wood from somewhere. It had to happen. There has to be a source of that wood. But where that is not said. But it's inherent within the command that there has to be a location for it. So when we talk about things that the church does, there are often times where somebody says, well, look, you say you need to have a Bible verse for everything you do, but show me the Bible verse for pews and carpet. Good point. There isn't one, right? But inherent within the commands there is. So, for example, if we talk about what the work of the church is, you start with the question, you say, what's the church's work? Well, we're given really 4 general commands of what the church's work is. We're supposed to assemble to worship. That's something the church is supposed to do. We're supposed to preach to the lost. That's something else you see the local church doing. We're also supposed to teach people who are already Christians. It's not like you become a Christian and then, who cares about you? We got you into the water and now we're done. So you're supposed to teach the saved. And there are some examples of caring for needy Christians that are also seen in the New Testament. These are the 4, what I'll say are 4 general commands that are out there of things that are in the church. Now, if somebody, and you'll get this debate sometimes, where somebody will say, well, I actually think there's a 5th one. Well, if you think there's a 5th one, what do you got to do? You got to prove it. That's it. You got to show me a verse. Show me a verse where the church, now not an individual, but the church. Now, why do we say not an individual, but the church? Is there a difference between things individuals can do and things the church can do? Yeah, and we have some really strong examples of that. 1 Timothy chapter 5 talks about an individual Christian taking care of a widow, and he says, if you take care of the widow, the church isn't burdened. Well, there's a good example of the difference, right? Are individual Christians a part of the church? Yes, they are. But am I the whole church? No, right? So if Scott does something, if I take care of a needy widow, the church doesn't have to take care of her. Do we agree with that premise? See, that's what 1 Timothy 5 is saying. They're different. In the same way, I can spend my money to go on a vacation somewhere, but if I just dipped into the church treasury and said, I'd really like a good vacation, and I take that money to go on a vacation, you'd have a problem with it, wouldn't you? Right? Because there's a difference between my money and the church's money. So here, when we talk about the work of the church, we're talking about things that we do collectively together. And it gets confusing for people because sometimes we forget that there is a difference between the individual and the group. Let me give you another example. State senators, right? State senators are important people. And when you are elected a state senator, how much of the day are you a state senator? When do people call you senator? Every time. Yeah, all day, right? All day, all night, you're a state senator. So, as a state senator, state senators make laws, right? We agree with this concept? You with me so far? State senators make laws. So, since I'm a state, we're going to imagine you elected me state senator. That'd be an awful idea. But just imagine for a second you made me a state senator. State senators make laws for Kentucky. And I'm a state senator what part of the day? All day. So at about 1 a.m., I wake up because I can't sleep, and I decide I want to make a new law, and so I just speak it into existence. Everybody must own a goldfish. That's the new law in Kentucky. Everybody has to own a goldfish. So I just say it because I'm a state senator. How often? All the time. Does that make it a law, though? No. And the reason is because just because I'm a state senator all the time doesn't mean I am doing things as the Senate all the time, am I? When does the Senate make laws? They gotta all come together, don't they? They don't just sit around the coffee. In fact, even if I got 5 or 6 state senators and we all sit around the coffee table and we say, Yeah, goldfish mandatory. Okay? That doesn't do it. There is an official capacity in which now the Senate is assembled and they vote on things and they make decisions. And if you don't know the difference between those two, you're going to have a lot of governmental problems. Now, the church is exactly the same way. Am I a Christian when? All the time. Are there times where as a Christian I'm working as part of Eastland? Yeah, we're doing stuff together. At 1 a.m. when I wake up and I can't sleep, and so I go to the fridge to go get a snack, is that Eastland getting a snack? No, that's just Scott. But we have to remember those differences because there are some commands that are clearly congregational ones and some that are clearly individual ones. Did you still have a question? Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. That's a whole different class. Yes. Yeah, so here's the great thing about Eastland. We're not a democracy. We're not, right? We're not a democracy. The whole reason we're having this class is because we're not a democracy. We have a constitution, right? This is the thing that we use, and we want to make sure that we understand the way God intended it. So, yeah, the Kentucky senator thing, that's just a silly example to kind of illustrate my point. But, yeah, no, we don't make new bills. Okay, so local church. So we have these general commands. One of them is you've got to assemble to worship. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 makes it clear we have to assemble. So if you have to assemble, you have to have a place to do that and you have to have a time. Does it tell us what place and what time to meet, though? No. So we've got to make that decision, and those are wisdom issues, right? So the place, it could be a building, it could be a park, it could be a home, it could be 4909 Bardstown Road. All of those are perfectly legitimate. Now, why don't we meet in a house versus 4909 Bardstown Road? Wouldn't be wrong to meet in a house. Why are we meeting here versus a house? That's it. It's just a wisdom issue, right? It would be foolish trying to get this many people into somebody's house. It becomes a logistical nightmare. And so we just have found a more, and the word here that is typically used is expedient or convenient or wise way to do things. You do that sort of stuff all the time. It's the same reason we don't meet at 2 in the morning. Okay, so we're gonna cover a couple more examples like this because last week this is where we got, but we stopped. And so we want to cover a couple more so you understand the principle of this applies across the board. So let's look at another one. Local church work, 4 different things, right? That hasn't changed. The commands are what the commands are. But now let's talk about caring for needy saints. Now, the command is caring for needy saints. What's a saint? Christian. So saint comes from the same word as holiness or sanctified. The people who are Christians are called saints in the Bible. If you are a Christian, you are a saint. That's biblical language. Now, the reason we say that one of the general commands is caring for needy saints or needy Christians is because we have no examples, not a single one, of the church caring for people who aren't Christian. None. Now, do we have examples of individual Christians caring for people who are not Christian? Yes. In fact, you absolutely ought to. Right? In fact, you're told as an individual, as you have opportunity, do good to all mankind, but especially those of the household of faith. So as an individual Christian, I should do good to all mankind. But again, that's an individual command. When we look at the church, there's some very specific rules that make it clear that it's just caring for needy Christians. Every single time the money was ever used to care for needy people, it was always needy Christians. Christians in poverty, Christians dealing with a famine, Christians who were widowed. These are the only examples we have. Now, if we had an example where it was not Christians, then that would change it, wouldn't it? But those are the only examples we have. And the first thing that I tell somebody when they have a question about that, why don't you have a food pantry? Why don't you take care of, world poverty? Why don't you, look, you could go into a lot of different debates, but the short debate that I have every time is I just say, show me an example of the church caring for just people who are needy in general, like just non-Christian. Show me an example. And the thing is, there isn't one. So we say, okay, well, here's the command. So needy Christians, you're going to have an actual person with an actual need, and you're going to have to decide on an amount to help. Can you fulfill the command to care for needy Christians without a person who has to be a what? They have to be a Christian, right? Without a need or without an amount. Is it possible to fulfill that command? You're going to have those three things. You see my point? Those are all necessities. But then the issue is wisdom. And this is one that the eldership has to struggle with all the time. If there is some sort of natural disaster, well, how many natural disasters are happening at any given moment in the world? It's all over the place, right? So you have to make a decision as a congregation, and that a lot of times comes down to the eldership making that decision, right? They're going to have to decide which needs are we going to take care of. Because if you just say every time there's a Christian need, what's going to happen? You're going to run out of money. You can't do it. It's an impossibility, right? So you're going to have to use some wisdom. Now, in the Old Testament, they had things like, even in the book of Acts, they had things like famine. Well, here's an interesting thing. In the book of Acts, there was a famine, and it was a worldwide famine. So the famine hits everybody. So whose life got worse because of the famine? Everybody. We in agreement there? If there's a worldwide famine, everybody's life gets worse. So here's Paul, and he's talking and telling congregations, you need to take care of people because there's this worldwide famine. And then he tells them, I want you to send money to the churches in Jerusalem or in the churches in Judea. You know how he did that? Because when there's a famine, who gets hurt the most by a famine? Anybody know who gets hurt the worst if there's a famine and all of a sudden there's a lack of food supply? Yeah, the people with the least resources. That's right. Those are the people hurting the most, right? Now, you and I, if there's a recession, we have to tighten the belt a little bit. Might need to eat out a little less often. These first world problems we have. But you go to a third world country and there's a recession, and they have to decide which kid eats. I mean, these are real problems. Legitimate things that they have to deal with is which kid eats today. So if you're going to make a decision as to where the money goes, Paul is saying, look, you each have a choice, but I really recommend you send to the churches in Jerusalem and Judea because that's an impoverished part of the world. And by doing that, you Gentile churches can let those Jewish ones know that you love them because you have a lot more than they do, so send it along. But that's a wisdom issue. And so we have these wisdom issues in all things. The other is the amount. And see, you have this problem you have this problem as an individual too, right? You have money to give to charitable works. Well, how much do you give? Because if you say, I'll just give till the need's gone, you don't have enough money to fix that. Jeff Bezos doesn't have enough money to fix that. Jesus even made the point, He said, you will have the poor with you how long? Always. Now, I don't say that as a positive thing. I'm not saying that as oh, that's wonderful. That's part of this broken world we live in. But the reality is that even as an individual in giving, you have to make a decision on amount, don't you? And so the church has to do the same thing. Now, how much do you send? Right? There's they have flooding in Texas, and there are churches where Christians have tons of things gone. Well, that happened a while back. Now we've got flooding in Florida. People having things wiped out. How much do you send? Well, you've got to make a wisdom decision on that. Is there a right answer? No, there's just wisdom. Okay? So this is another example of it. Okay, let me give you a third one. Music. So this is where we start to talk about something that tends to make us as the church really stand out. One of the first things that stands out when somebody walks into the building of a congregation of the Lord's people is they go, I noticed something different. You sing without instruments. That makes us stand out. And people have a lot of different guesses as to why that is. Well, maybe y'all just have beautiful voices, and we just want to really hear your voices because that's the most melodic sound out there. Is that the reason why? No. I love you, but no, right? That's not why. They can't afford a band or an orchestra or a piano. That's another one I've heard. Is that why? We're just too poor for instruments. Well, that's not it either. It all comes down to that basic thing. When it comes to music, what's the command? The command isn't, we're not told to play. In the New Testament, we're not told to play. We're not told to sing and play. We're told to sing. That's the general command. The general command is sing. In the New Testament. Now, if you go to the Old Testament, did they use instruments in the Old Testament? Yes, they did. They also kept the Sabbath. They also sacrificed animals. So if I'm going to go to the Old Testament and say, look, in the Old Testament they used instruments, see, that's fine. What other things am I going to have to start adding in? We're going to have to start investing in some sheep too. Right? We're also going to have to keep the Sabbath. We're also going to have to worry about clean and unclean food. We're going to have with a lot of stuff, right? We're going to have to get some fancy priestly garments, right? Because there's stipulations in the Old Testament about the clothes that priests wore. And by the way, in the New Testament, who are the priests? It's us, so you all better get some fancy priest clothes. See, do you see the problem? If I start going to the Old Testament for commands, I got some major issues that I'm going to have to deal with. But if I just go to the New Testament, that's all we're going to do. We'll just go to the New Testament and say, okay, when it came to music, what did the church do? You're not going to find a single verse, not a single one, other than sing. That's it. It's not a complicated thing. And that is so true that even the word a cappella means as the church or like the church. For years and years and years and years, that was just the way that people even thought about it. They said, well, yeah, people have music, lots of different kind of music, but when people are just singing together, you know what that's like? Oh, that's like the church. History even backs that idea up. But I don't need the historical stuff. All I need is the New Testament. If I'm going to follow the New Testament, and I don't want to be like Uzzah and get knocked dead by touching the ark, and I don't want to be like Nadab and Abihu who offer strange fire, because we have very clear examples from God that He cares about how He's worshipped, right? It's a big deal to Him. What's singing? When we sing, what are we doing? Worship, so He cares about how He's worshipped, right? It matters to Him. So all I do is I go in and say, oh, well, the only command we have is sing. Now, here's the thing, though. When you go to sing, you cannot sing without pitch, volume, tempo, words, and harmony. I missed it. We got the pro here. That's enough. Okay, there may be a couple of other ones, but by and large, this is the basics. You can't sing without some sort of volume. You can sing quiet, you can sing loud, but you gotta pick one, right? You gotta have some sort of pitch. It can even be pitchy, but you still gotta have one, right? You gotta have some sort of tempo, some sort of words that you're saying. There has to be some way of harmonizing. Now, we can make that real basic. We can all harmonize by all singing the same note, right? Typically we do 4-part harmonization here in America. But does it have to be 4-part harmonization? No, you can do it a number of different ways, but you do have to have some harmony, right? So here's the thing. When it comes to the words, let's talk about that for a second. The words we're going to pick. We could sing psalms. We could sing hymns. We could sing spiritual songs. We could sing love ballads. We could sing rock and pop. What's the problem? What's the problem with what I put up there? 2 of them do not match the biblical injunction. Because if you go back and look at the verses on singing, he says you're to sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So, since we're supposed to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, the latest T-Swift is out. I'm so sorry. You're just going to have to make some choices. For those of you who do not even know who T-Swift is, your life isn't any worse. It's okay. Just move along. But the fact is that there is a command that narrows it down. But in the realm of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, does that narrow it down to 3? How many songs we got in our songbook? I don't know. We don't even have them out now. But 500 plus, you said 700. We got a ton of them. And every once in a while somebody's like, oh, we've learned a new song, and so we're going to put it up on the, I just about said overhead. That's so dating. Yeah, John. That's something John would say. And it's a brand new song. So we keep adding psalms and hymns and spiritual songs all the time. Is that okay? Yeah, perfectly fine. Okay, well, I see what you're saying. Well, you could do a rock or pop tempo, but it would still have to be, the words would have to not be, like, you could have a country tempo, but we're not going to sing about how your dog died and left, right? So in terms of the words, right? So words, we're not going to have the typical love ballad, the typical rock pop ballad, right? We're not going to sing about how, what's rock going to be? How you did drugs and you're happier. I don't know. We're not going to sing that stuff, right? We can pick a tempo, but yeah, yes. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Right. So if you go to the idea of worship, so now we're going to go back to the question, what if you got a choir? We just say, let's just get some people, and I'm going to simplify this issue because there are some more nuanced issues, but let's say we just pick a choir, we're going to pick the best singers, and they're going to sing, and so they're singing, and they pick the pitch, the volume, the tempo, the words, the harmony, and by the way, they do a better job at all of those things than all the rest of us, so we put them up here, and we all listen to them sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. What's the problem with that? That's it. Not everybody's doing it. The command is to all of us doing it together. Yeah. Yes. Amen. That's exactly it. So with everything we do, what we have to do is always run it through the mechanism of the Scripture, right? Ask, are we really something that fulfills the command, and am I doing something necessary to do that? And in that case, you're now doing something where, as Perry said, we now have an audience and we have performers. Does that match the spiritual injunction? No, it doesn't. We're all supposed to worship. So, yeah. Okay. Any comments or questions, anything else before we move on? Great point. Yeah, that's a great point. We gather together to take the Lord's Supper, and we don't just say, well, whoever can chew best, they get to do it, right? No, it's everybody does it. And so you're absolutely right. So, yeah, I know, Scott. I say all sorts of things that people think preachers aren't allowed to say that. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes. No, it's a great point, because all forms of worship are meant to be done by all Christians, right? We don't go, oh, we only have a few worship. Even though you could say the same thing with prayer. Are there some Christians who are better at praying than others? Yeah. Yeah. So we're just going to have them do the praying for us now. The rest of us, we just forget it. We got some experts. Let's have them do the praying and we'll just hang out. Of course we wouldn't do that. So that's a great point, comparing it to other areas of worship. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Okay. So here, let's see here. Is this another? Yeah, this is kind of same thing. It's but just another added thing. So you have to pick a pitch. We could pick a pitch a lot of different ways. So one thing that gets brought up is, well, you say you're against instrumental music, but you have a guy, he goes and stands up there, and right before he leads the song, what does he often do? Yeah, he'll blow a note. And that's on a pitch pipe, which is an instrument, right? It's an instrument. But there's a difference between a pitch pipe and a harmonica, isn't there? Right? If you play the pitch pipe, you find the pitch, and then what do you do with the pitch pipe next? Put it away in the pocket. Because it's just helping you find the pitch, which you need to have, right? Now, here's a weird question. Could we have a trumpet? Could we have a trumpet to find the pitch? Yeah. Yeah. It'd be kind of silly, right? It's like meeting at 2 a.m. Could we meet at 2 a.m. on Sunday? Yeah, we could. I'm not really interested in that, but we could. But what often happens, though, is, what do you often find to be the case when people do things that are not wise? Because that's what this is. It's a wisdom issue. Somebody brings in a trumpet and they say, we're just going to use it to find the pitch. What's going to probably happen 6 months later? Yeah, we're going to bring something else in. We start pulling in all of these other things, and it's not long before you're not following the biblical command. Would it be wrong to have a piano in the corner that we went over and said, ding, and there's our pitch? No, perfectly fine. Totally fine. No, I don't have any issue with that whatsoever. Realistically, what often happens when the piano starts in the corner? Yeah, it doesn't stay in the corner, does it? Now, do you have to use wisdom with decisions like that? Yeah. That's life, right? How many times in your life do you have to make decisions over things that say, we could do it these two ways, but this one seems like it will have a better long-term result? And that's every day. This isn't any different than what you're doing in your individual life. And so, you have a pitch pipe, and now, a lot of times it's not a pitch pipe, it's an iPhone, right? Somebody pulls out their phone, it has an app, and you use that. Is that just as fine as a pitch pipe? Of course it is. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. People are just being wise. It's individual wisdom to find the pitch. But again, what are we doing? We're singing, because that's the command. Okay. Now, what we're going to begin to do is we're going to begin to pivot and look at a few other things regarding how important some of these principles are and what a big deal they are. Every single thing on that list, I can tell you, is something that is going on right now in churches in Louisville. Every single one of those things are things that you could find a church in Louisville that is involved in these things. Now here's the problem. Show me anything on that list that is not a good work. Isn't a good thing. Well, is it good for Christians to play sports and do things together? Teach good sportsmanship to your kid? Yeah, okay, so it's a good thing, right? Now, we're going to ask the second question, which is it good for the church to do it? That's a separate question. But do you see the problem of, look, if I look at all of those things, point out the ones that are just so evil. I mean, this is such an evil thing. See, that's the problem. It isn't. It doesn't. They don't present themselves as this is some horrible, evil thing. But the problem is if you find churches doing all of these things, it all is because of the issue of what do we do when the Scriptures are silent? Because now I'll ask you another question. Which one of these things on that list is something that you see the Scriptures talking about churches doing? Oh, yeah, absolutely. And as individual Christians, we're commanded to do the same thing. Do good to all mankind, right? Absolutely. But I'm talking about now as a church. Are there any examples of the church as a whole, as a group, not individuals, but as a whole doing these things? You won't find them. You'll find individuals doing those things, but you won't find the whole church doing those things. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. History is boring. We're going to try and make it a little less boring, okay? This became a major debate even amongst Protestant churches. Okay, so if you go back to the Protestant movement, anybody happen to know why they call the Protestant movement the Protestant movement? They're protesting. Yeah, they're protesting against Catholicism. Now, Catholicism had made a major mistake. They made a lot of them. But there was one particular one that really stood out, okay? And the one particular one that really was standing out when the Protestant movement began is they began to do something called indulgences. And in fact, I know a brother, he even has a Bible. Within the front of it, there's a list of indulgences and the pricing that they used to have. It was that well known. It was a menu, and indulgences were this. If you want to commit a sin, it's still a sin, but if you pay us this amount or go through whatever we tell you to do, you can indulge in that sin this one time. Well, that was a bridge too far for guys like Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli and many others, and they said, that's too much. This is crazy. So they protested, and there was a protest against Catholicism, and rightfully so. If tomorrow I got up and I started to tell you, here's the price tag for sins. You just come and you pay me the money and you can commit the sin. You better do something about that. That's not good. But within the Protestant movement, now they're having to go back to the drawing board and decide what is it that we're going to do. If we're not going to be Catholic, what are we going to be? Right? So we have this new question. If we're not going to be Catholic and we're not going to just do what the Pope says on high and comes on down, if we're not going to do that, what are we going to do? So they started reading their Bible. And Martin Luther is arguably the most famous person of the Protestant movement. Lesser known guy is Ulrich Zwingli, and part of that was because Zwingli and Luther ended up debating this issue. Luther said, well, the way that we're going to do this is we're going to find some core principles in the Scripture, and we're going to deal with those, and we're going to say these are the core principles, and one of those core principles is that you're saved by faith. We're going to deal with those things, and then we're going to leave the rest of it to human tradition and time and culture. And Luther kept as many Catholic traditions as they could. In fact, if you go to a traditional Lutheran service, they look quite a lot like a Catholic service. Not the same, but there's quite a lot kept the same. And the reason for that is because Luther wasn't interested in getting as far away as possible from Catholicism. He said, let's find the core principles, and then let's just reform it, which is why he's often referred to as the leader of the Reformation movement. Zwingli, on the other hand, said, well, why are we just trying to find core principles? And I'll tell you up front, I'm biased. I think Zwingli was right. Zwingli said, why are we just trying to find core principles? Because one of the problems is if we say these are the core principles, who decided what are the core principles? We did. We made that decision that these ones matter and these ones don't. So we have a problem here. Zwingli said, well, why don't we just go back to the Bible and have it provide a complete blueprint for all time that tells us how the church should be governed, how we should worship, all the rules for behavior. And interestingly, those who were with Zwingli, those guys threw out everything they could not find in the scriptures, and they did it literally. They took the cathedrals that they were worshiping in and they stripped them bare. They removed the relics, they removed the organs, they removed the altar equipment, they got rid of the priestly clothing, and so much more. They physically said, let's get rid of all of this stuff, because if it's not in the text, we aren't interested. The vast majority of the Protestant movement went with Luther, because it allowed them to keep as many of their traditions as they wanted. Zwingli, very few people in comparison stuck with Zwingli, and the reason is it sure seemed drastic. And if people have a choice between making drastic changes in their life or a little bit of change, guess what most people choose? They always choose a little bit of change, right? I'll change as little as I have to. And I bring all of this up to say that last slide that I showed you with all of the various things that came up, all of that exists because of the idea of let's just pick the core principles and not worry about the rest. But if we're going to truly be Bible people, we throw it out unless there's a reason to bring it in. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 Mm-hmm. Individual. Yep. Individual command. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Okay. We'll stop there. We'll pick up and look at some more of these principles starting next week. And like I said, we're starting to wind down class here. Thanks so much.